go, I just
Sure.
have a little administrative thing. I just want to let the planning board members know that Jesse Stein has submitted and filed a Mullins form for the public hearing for the warrant article for scenic roads for the meeting that he had missed. So he is good to go to continue as part of the planning board for this, for the record. Sorry, Marnie.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. That's wonderful news. Thanks, Jesse. So when we last spoke, we had like kind of a discussion around, do we define scenic or not? And so the plan was that I would go visit 68 streets, and I didn't count, but I got probably 2/3 through. I didn't get all 68 streets, but I did want to kind of share, let me share my screen and just share a couple of things.
You should be good to go, Marnie.
Perfect. You guys can see this? Okay. So we had discussed, consideration to revise the bylaw language. And so the first thing that I thought about was the steps required to change what scenic is in our bylaw, which is actually a separate. It could be this warrant article, but I think it's actually a separate warrant article. So I think that would require us to do a separate inscription or writing about how the code would define scenic if we went that route. So I think that's something for us to contemplate today. But the plan was, I had proposed 8 rather broad definitions of criteria to which to designate a scenic road, and the criteria that shall be considered, but not necessarily must be considered. And so there were 8. Definitely included the tree and the stone wall, but then it also included 3, which was ways bordered by other natural or man-made, like fields, orchards, water, or something like that. Ways for which alteration is being planned or is likely to be planned in the future. That's kind of a hard thing to define. 5, ways which any alteration would lessen the aesthetic value of natural or man-made features bordering them. And then we had age. The last 3 are really around kind of more historic components: age and historic significance of the roads, the built features such as historic buildings, historic monuments, etc., or the road features such as the historic layout, the surface, or the carriage width, and non-historic bridges. So using those criteria, I'm just going to pull up my second sheet here. This is very, very small. I built an Excel spreadsheet. And so I basically went through and I did them alphabetically. So I try to indicate if they had trees, stone wall, man-made natural border, the alteration planned in the future, alteration would lessen the value, age and his significance. Oops, that's spelled wrong. Sorry, I can't leave that be. Built features for buildings, monuments, burial ground, etc., or road features. And so as we go through, I'm just going to kind of high level scroll through. What most of them have are trees, natural man-made borders. I felt that alteration would lessen the aesthetic value of the streets. And some of them had built features, such as they had flags on them, like a monumental, like within the cul-de-sac, they had a middle section with a American flag in them. Or, for example, Barn Lane had a barn at the beginning, which is a historical building. So I try to indicate where, or not a lot of non-historic bridges in some of these roads too. So I indicated where a lot of these fell out. And as I said, I got through 67% of these before I just ran out of time. And those that I knew kind of just off the top of my head, I was able to fill out. So when looking at that, it would appear that most of these streets would qualify under the scenic road definition, being that we'd have 8 criteria from which we could consider that it qualifies as a scenic road. So that's the first thing I just wanted to update the planning board on. So the second thing was the consideration that Mr. Muria mentioned is it administrative. And so as I went through all of this, I think what these scenic definition and administrative, what it kind of reinforced to me is that if they all meet these requirements and we could actually find examples for definition across the board, why not just simplify it and go back to the recommendation that Ms. Demiria had and what originally Mr. Morris had presented, which is really just take the roads and bring them all on as a scenic road, with potentially some alterations to the language in the warrant article. So I'm going to stop if there's any questions, and then I'll pull up the warrant articles. Okay.
I just have one quick comment, Marnie.
Yeah.
So the criteria that shall be considered.
Yes.
So shall means must in legalese.
Okay. Okay. So must be considered. So we're considering them.
Okay.
But I guess the point of the matter is that all 8, it's not all 8 are required to be
Right.
met.
Yeah.
So even if one is met, it would still kind of meet the definition of scenic, at least in my review of this definition.
Marnie, I just want to thank you for driving around and looking at roads. Mimi and I have driven around and looked at trees. So I think we're covering the bases here with these warrant articles. But before you go on, I just wanted to let you know, I did go back because I thought maybe I was a little bit harsh at the last meeting. And you know, I still feel strongly that the law doesn't define scenic road, except for that it has protection for trees and stone walls. And so I was unwilling to go past that. But I thought, okay, I need to kind of maybe get educated and go out there and look at some of the bylaws that you looked at. I will say some of them are really interesting, but the definition I think you just mentioned, in some of them, for example, Wayland has a whole chapter, just like we're creating a chapter on trees, potentially with our tree bylaw. The definition is part of a larger explanation of how the town will handle scenic roads. And I just want you to know, I found it very interesting. There are things that I hadn't even contemplated. And I actually think it would help people to understand in the larger context what that means. So just not to go down this road, but Wayland happens to have only 6 of these criteria, not 8, but they do talk about, for example, work affecting trees or stone walls and emergencies. You know, maybe that's covered in our tree bylaws or someplace else. They talk about considerations when acting on applications, and one of them is public safety and traffic. And I found that to be very interesting. As you know, we've got a couple of applications before the boards with you know, either 40Bs or commercial projects where potentially the developer has purchased a parcel of land on a scenic road to be able to use that as an egress. And I find that particularly egregious. And, you know, maybe there's a 40B consideration, maybe it's all waived, but I have been kind of searching down that trail. And I do note that at some point, even if it's not now, because it seems that this warrant article is really to define the trees, but we may want to add to it and discuss, you know, some of these other things. I think if we do go that route, we would have to have a definition. It seems, I'm not 100% sure about that. But it does talk about driveways and egress, at least the Wayland bylaw that I was looking at. And honestly, I think that would help people to understand what the power of designating a scenic road, and we don't have that in our bylaw. And, you know, maybe we will one day. But I just wanted to mention that I do think that the definition goes with the larger chapter on what you can and can't do to a scenic road. And I hope as a planning board, we get to the point where we say, you can't do that on a scenic road, because other towns have further defined. Sorry, I've got landscapers.
No
So
worries.
that's my comment. Thank you.
So as you're talking, I pulled up the Wayland scenic roads article that was accepted at one of their town meetings. So you're right. So it's very broad. And I think what we would need to do is to be able to kind of reevaluate, like I know some of the driveways, and that are part of our site plan. So it's really like broader zoning that would need to kind of be considered.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. I think that this would require like a different approach for a warrant article versus just kind of the acceptance of streets as scenic right now. But I
Yes.
do think it's something we should consider as a planning board. So
Okay.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I do too. And I feel like I had to go through that to just really understand where you were coming from because I was vehemently against it. So I feel that these definitions aside, I still feel that, beside tree and stone wall, you know, are part of a larger bylaw. And I think possibly I would request that the planning board look at something larger because it does clearly define, I guess what the town, if the town were to approve it, it would basically be putting a stake in the ground saying, if there's a driveway, try not to take down this public shade trees that are protected on a scenic road. Don't take down trees or stone walls, for example, for commercial projects. There's quite a lot in there that I know that we try to put into major site plan approval and in other ways. But we're not absolutely protected, I think, until we have like a bylaw in the future.
So thank you for your diligence because I feel like you've done so much in support and I appreciate that. So where I ended up after doing the drive, looking at the streets is coming back to the two, the warrant articles that, let me just blow this up so you can see it. So I put together two options and let me also just give a little bit of background. When I presented a conservation commission, Russ Gregory was pretty adamant that he wouldn't really want to support this, but he was willing to have us like an offline discussion. So Russ and I actually went on a road tour on Monday night for about an hour and a half of driving streets and just seeing kind of what's going on in our town around the public shade trees, how they're cared for or lack of care really around the public shade trees. It really doesn't look like our town does what it should be doing to keep our town beautiful around maintenance. So many like literally dead trees just hanging out or very close to falling. And so I do think there should be a broader thinking around how do we as a town address this. One of my points to Russ was that if we have everything labeled as a scenic road, beyond the numbers or those dictated by Mass General Law that can't be scenic, I think it makes it so much easier logistically and administratively to Mr. Muria's point on Monday. And so that's where I'm falling. His request was, is there a way where you can wrap in some of that language around administrative and management of trees into the warrant article? And so I have modified and I put two options forward based on kind of that experience with Russ, my experience doing the diligence and then driving the streets. So this option one adds in language to explain the rationale. And so this is exactly everything that's not bolded is the language that was put forward in the previous three scenic hearing meetings that the town agreed to. Where I've added this is simplification of town administrative and logistical road management. And maybe it's not, maybe I don't know if it's road management or scenic road management, but I think by adding that, it kind of expresses this is why we're doing this. It's to actually get everyone aligned to there is a process, there are laws, and we would like to reinforce that through making every road in Southborough a scenic road. I think where I would support this is actually, we had a guest at one of our meetings, and it was Grant Farrington who'd made the comment that what would be really helpful for the public is to define how Southborough defines scenic is not bucolic, is not beautiful, is not those words that we in our mind think when we think scenic, but it truly is protection of trees and stone walls. And if we kind of put that language out in front of the general audience. Plus, I'm willing to share my field trip. I just only have 5 minutes on it. I think we could kind of explain to the town that the rationale for defining scenic, like abandon all your definitions of what you've known, what growing up, but how we, this town, define scenic is not how the towns around us define it. But today we define it this way. And that's where I would either say option number 1, which includes this language of simplification of town administrative and logistical road management. And then we list the 68 streets. And option 2 is really just exactly as the former 3 scenic road bylaws were, or sorry, scenic roads were brought into town meeting, is to use that exact language. So that's kind of where I'm falling in my recommendation to the board. And, I know we do have to make a decision, is to vote for option number 1. And then I would pull together the presentation for the meeting, which actually helps to explain kind of my journey to help define and where we are now.
Thank you, Marnie. So after your field trip, so you took the definitions, which are very similar to many of the other towns that you looked into, and went on your field trip, and you found that most of the roads that you visited qualified for scenic based on the definition.
Correct. Although, like, the caveat is I did not get to the last third in time for this meeting. My suspicion is that the last third will also fall into at least a couple of criteria of the 8 that we've listed.
Yeah, so I think that's very important to mention at town meeting, that we heard what was said in the fall. You looked into many definitions, you took the basics from the definitions, and then went on a field trip to visit all the roads that we're proposing as scenic roads, and they did all fall within that definition. Very good, thank you very much. So I'd support the option 1 that mentions the administrative, and yeah. And you may want to put scenic road management, just to be specific. And I think that from listening to previous Conservation Commission meetings, I think that somehow there was a belief that having roads designated as scenic roads would somehow not enable dead trees to come down, or would somehow stop maintenance of public shade trees, but I'm pretty sure they're not being maintained now.
Yeah, not to speak for Russ or the chair, Mr. Pazamato, he's never been attending the meetings that I'm at. So I unfortunately don't get his direct feedback, but I think Russ spoke for many, just kind of the concern that because the town isn't being maintained, the onerous requirement of a planning board plus a tree warden hearing would seem to make it logistically complicated. And I had expressed to Russ that you have a planning board that is willing to have the meetings whenever the meetings need to happen, that we don't need to wait 5 years. There were trees that have been on a list and compiled for many years, and there's been no process approached to even involve the planning board. So we weren't even aware that those trees had been called in, that people were calling to the DPW. So I think with all of your efforts and making, with the olive branch and really trying to kind of bridge that with Ms. Bracchio from the select board, I think we're making strides, but I believe Russ fully understood that it really is not the planning board and that there's just other challenges and issues that need to be resolved. I had suggested that if we just did this in an administrative way, and he hasn't seen this language, so I can't suggest that he would agree to it. But I think he was of the mindset, if it makes this logistically, administratively, the right way to do it, so we can actually start to maintain our roads in town and the trees by the roads, and really to help the beautification. And, much to our special guest from forestry, who shared like how important it is to start to weed out trees that may not be trees. And his request to me was, we should think about how we define a tree. Is a tree like a very small sapling, or is it, and we have 100 of them in one area vying for the same sunlight? Do we think about management of that area and weed things out so that other trees can grow and they don't compete for space and eventually die prematurely? So he just really brought an education to me. I fully appreciated his time, and I've taken his suggestion, and I will provide this back to conservation as well as historics commission to be able to provide perspective if they want to be able to support this at town meeting.
Hey, Marnie, awesome work. So thanks so much for taking this on and doing such a great job with it. And I really feel like this option one addresses the concerns that were raised at town meeting. And to me, if people who are just fundamentally against the protection that is in the spirit of the bylaw, then they'll find some other reason to poke a hole and vote against. But this certainly reconciles the objections that were raised at the last town meeting. So the one thing I'm a little confused on the need for subsequent warrant articles, or because that's what the naysayers, so to speak, would use against us, is any kind of ambiguity on this.
So just to comment on that, Jesse, I think I think it's just more of really a holistic review of both our zoning, like what we have in place now. I think what Ms. Demuria suggested based on, and I'll have her make her comments too, but I think that based on reading Wayland does have very clear language around scenic roads. Also, the other point though is Wayland doesn't define every road as scenic. So I think there is some differences. We've also incorporated a lot of the protection language in the tree bylaw that Ms. Luttrell is putting forward. So I think we actually accomplish what we need to accomplish now for the trees, for the roads in both bylaws separately. But I think as we look out around the long-term journey for Southborough, it's maybe time to kind of just reevaluate how we are looking at things like the maintenance and the protection of the trees. And I know there's a lot in the tree law, but I just, there's things and components in other bylaws that are just really interesting that we should evaluate. So it's not necessarily building. I don't think these are ambiguous. I don't think the tree bylaw is ambiguous. I think this is very straightforward as well. So I would hope that that concern goes away, Jesse, when we maybe just do a retrospective review of our holistic zoning and just say, does this all make sense, and how it moving forward as we project and grow and think about the next 25 years.
I just feel, I feel like for me, bringing that up conjures, going back in time to the ZAC and endless public hearings and ultimate failure of the zoning code, the holistic zoning code revision. So I'm 100% with Mimi on supporting option one, and I support this warrant article. Just sort of cautioning, just from my perspective, looking at how things go at town meeting, the reliance on a future holistic review will, create, what our former council used to call a chilling effect at town meeting. Thanks.
Thanks for the caution.
So, Marnie, I'll just say, I also support option one. I think it's a nice little improvement that, I think will help people to understand what it is that we're trying to do. And I hope it's helpful. I think that, I'm too ambivalent about expanding anything having to do with scenic roads, but I would say before I was a member, I remember one of the planning board members, I don't know who, asking the question to Mimi when the first review of the tree bylaw is, well, if it's already covered in Mass General Law, why do we need this big, new section on trees? Why can't we just say we reference Mass General Law? And actually that's a sentiment that comes up again and again and again, and it has to do with procedure, is because it is in Mass General Law, and anything I think that we would do has to be either, procedural to clarify what does it really mean. So the part that would not, by the way, much of what is discussed in Wayland's has to do with management of trees. And if you're going to chop down a tree, cutting, is there a fine, this kind of stuff. And that is, not necessary for us because we have a proposed tree bylaw. But when it comes to stone walls, which is the other component of scenic, how do we mandate whether something's taken down, not taken down, has to be replaced? So it just gives a little bit more clarity, but I agree with you. We'd have to look at it and make sure that it's something that we think is necessary. It may not be necessary, but I think that this addition to the warrant article is necessary, because I've been kind of perplexed about the naysayers. I wonder if it's just a person here or there. Remember, the boards that you're going to, Historic Commission and Conservation Commission, were asked, if they wanted to kind of co-sponsor this warrant article. So maybe that's a little bit of a higher bar than just showing up at town meeting and casting a vote. It's okay with me if they don't want to go along with us. It was a nice gesture, but if there's one person that still doesn't agree, it's okay. They can cast their vote at town meeting if they show up. And, but I feel strongly that this additional sentence is really what we're trying to get to. And yeah, I do support it. So thanks for all the work that you did, Marnie.
My pleasure.
Just two quick points. One is that scenic roads provide additional protection, and the only protection for stone walls, but trees, public shade trees, are protected also under Chapter 87. And additionally, Chapter 87 defines a tree, anything that requires a hearing, is 1.5 inches or more. So that's pretty small, but that's Mass General Law.
Thank you.
So thank you, Marnie. Is there anything else on scenic roads? It seems like we're all in support of this option. I don't think we need to take a vote on it, do we? We'll just proceed with the hearings with this option.
Hey, Mimi.
Yep.
In my experience with the warrant article, public hearings, or votes or anything like that, we just keep everything open and do not vote.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
So I had, so on to the next thing, which is Fayville Hall.
Mimi, real
Yes.
quick beforehand, Marnie, are you able to provide us that document
Yep, I'll
And-
send it
and
right
the-
over.
spreadsheet that
Yes.
you showed? And I think that presentation we already had, correct?
Yeah, this is the most recent update, so I'll send that all over.
Okay, thank you.
And is this an open hearing? Is there anybody in the audience that would like to, are we going to open it up to public comment?
We currently have 3 attendees in the attendee list.
No hands up.
If anyone would like to comment, please raise your hand.
No hands raised.
So I had added Fayetteville Hall because last Friday, the select board had a meeting on whether or not to
Exercise.
exercise
They're afraid
Or-
of first refusal.
or not to exercise it, to get rid of it. I just lost the word. And they had planned on making a decision then, but then it was asked if the board could reach out for further comment for boards and committees. And we have until tomorrow at noon. So I wanted to ask if the planning board wanted to offer comment on that. They were going to rescind the right of first refusal, and whether the planning board wanted to formally comment on things that they would like to see as conditions of that. If the select board does vote to rescind their right of first refusal. And a couple of things I was thinking of was to have a preservation restriction put on the building, since it was 2 lots were sold for $21,000 because the town wanted to preserve the building. And I think the Historical Society intends to put a preservation restriction on it, but I think that needs to be clear. And the writing that was formerly in the deed, town council said is very broad, and if we want it to be preserved, the preservation restriction is the way to go. The other thing was to make sure that the parking is reserved. We had also asked the previous sale that parking spaces be reserved for the park across the street. And the third thing was to reserve our right of first refusal if the building changes hands again. So those were my thoughts. Anyone else, Mr. Stein?
Thank you, Mimi. This has brought, now I have to preface my comment with an apology to my fellow board members. As usual, I've been preoccupied by non-town government matters. And this issue has brought some things to light to me that I did not know. For example, I, in my ignorance, did not know that the town does not have any oversight or control over the Southborough Historical Society's activities. And the funding for this, for the plans, so to speak, and I put that in quotes, comes from an action that, in my view, if there had been any public input allowed or sought, heaven forbid, would not have occurred. So in my view, this is an opportunity. This is sort of our last opportunity to exercise any control at all over this entity. And we would be remiss if we did not, in exchange for rescission of the first refusal, to have some town controls over our valued inventory and artifacts that the Southborough Historical Society is in charge of. What form that will take, I'm not prepared to say exactly in this meeting now, but I'll certainly be giving it some thought. Thank you.
So Jesse, just to be clear, this would be specific to just Fayetteville Hall.
Well,
So you're correct. The Historical Society is a private 501c.
what are they going to
nonprofit
do with
that-
it, Mimi?
So they had written some plans on their page to have like a museum there and
Mm-hmm.
classes.
Right, and what's going to be in the museum? Probably some historical stuff.
Right.
That's where I'm going.
Yeah. But I
I
don't
don't
know.
want them to be able to sell the stuff at will on their own with zero public input. That's all. So I guess what I'm saying is I would extend our historical or our preservation restriction to the contents, the physical contents, if we're going to allow this. And I am not being a municipal law expert, may need to get town council involved to see if and how such a restriction could be written and enforced.
Ms. Houlihan?
Thank you, Mimi, for your diligence. I would completely concur that a preservation for the building is really important as part of the requirements. And I agree with both 2 and 3 that you've recommended. So I would be in fully support. I would echo my concerns. So while this is not the forum for it, I think what Mr. Stein has just brought up is it's disconcerting as a public member of the town to know that our only declaration copy was sold without any public comment. I read about it on my Southborough. I never knew anything about it. And I think to hear that that's being leveraged to purchase a building that was specifically designated as a car and art and a museum for the previous proponent. It doesn't feel good. So while I understand the requirement to kind of have some oversight of what they do, I don't know if we can, but I think we can at least command clarity around what we expect of the building and how to maintain the building for the town's enjoyment. Thanks, Mimi.
Thank you. Mr. Maria?
So I was looking for an example where the town has put a restriction for an additional right of first refusal, like in a situation like this, and I just don't happen to know of any. And I was just wondering about that. So they have right of first refusal. If this building were to convey again, do they have right of first refusal? Have we have examples of that in town? If it sells again, do we get right of first refusal again? I'm just wondering about that concept. Is there an example where we've put a restriction that it goes back to the town for right of first refusal again and again, or even one more time? I have to tell you, I did listen to the select board. I heard, for very good reasons, I heard that come up as a possible condition. And it struck me at that time, I'd never heard of that, but I'm not familiar with the legal agreements around these things.
I don't know of any other example. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to look into this. We were given a week for all boards and committees to meet and opine on this. Fortunately, we already had this meeting set up, and I'm sure many other boards and committees were unable to put together a meeting in a week. So we won't really be able to do much research, but
yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea. I would just question whether maybe it's a great idea, to be honest. And if that's the case, we should incorporate that into the procedure. If a building's historical and it conveys, maybe it should be a condition of every, that the town gets right of first refusal again to be able to preserve these historic structures. I guess I'm just curious to know. I don't object to it, Mimi, but I just wanted to know. It felt to me that it was just being put in place specifically for the Historical Society. And I guess I would just want to make sure that's not the case, that there's maybe some precedent that when you use this sort of procedure, it can, it commonly goes back to the town for right of first refusal. So that's my only comment, but I don't object to it.
Okay, I don't know of another building in town that we sold for so much far under market value, just for the reason that it be protected. So I don't think it's necessarily has anything to do with the fact that it's being purchased by the Historical Society. I think it's just a very valuable historic asset that the town wants to preserve.
Yeah. So I'm in agreement with it. It's fine
Yeah.
for me.
Debbie, I can cite from when I've been here, nothing really about buildings, but I know when open space is restricted during, say, subdivision approval, and the entity offers up a couple lots, which typically there's a time frame of 3 years, and if the town doesn't purchase those 2 lots within 3 years, it's kind of their right of first refusal in a kind of corollary way, that the lots go back to the developer in order to build homes on. That's the only quasi-related type of first refusal I've seen in the 6 years I've been here.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. And is it because it's sort of below fair market value? Is that, do you think, have anything to do with it, that it gives an opportunity for fair market value, whether it's on that example you gave or in this example?
You mean in regards to the price of the lots to purchase them back?
Yeah,
Yeah, I would think that, it's just my opinion, but it seems that it would be the market value to purchase those. That came up on Deerfoot Road as well, when the Peter Dowd's properties came up for sale. If you recall, the town had the option to contemplate those first right of refusal. Also, Mimi, remember Beth, the prior conservation agent, and you and me and Freddie had worked on a chapter 61 method of what happens with chapter 61 property, because the town does have first right of refusal. But that's all, that's property, and that is private property with, I don't know why, I can't remember why Peter Dowd's property came up as why the town had first right to purchase that. I think because it was in chapter 61.
It was in chapter
That's
61.
why. That was the triggering criteria for that.
And that's been the most common. Well, this is the first building that I know of with the right of first refusal, but it's usually chapter 61.
Yeah, so just wanted to add that.
Okay.
thank you.
Does anyone in the public have any comment they would like to add? Raise your hand.
Currently 3 attendees, no
Yeah.
hands raised.
Okay. So if we're all in agreement, I will draft a letter that requests a preservation restriction be put on the property, that we retain our right of first refusal should the building change hands in the future, and we retain the parking easement for parking for the park across the street. Anything else?
Contents, as Jesse said. If there's any town contents in the building.
Oh, so that, I don't think that can be a requirement of the
Restriction.
Yeah, rescinding our right of first refusal. I don't think that the contents that are the society believes that they own, we can take any control of, but I can certainly request that the select board do some due diligence in the future to try and determine the ownership of those contents. I think there's a school of thought that the society is holding those contents and taking care of them for the town, and that they're actually owned by the town. So it'd be good to know whether the society actually owns the things in the museum, or if they are in fact town property.
And it's
So I
my
can mention that.
understanding- Yeah, and it's my
So
underst-
Mimi, I do defer to you on preservation restrictions, because I'm aware that you have a lot more experience and knowledge in the drafting and enforcement of such restrictions. But maybe if you could just explain to me why we couldn't include the contents in a restriction.
So the right of first refusal is on the building on Fayville Hall. There are no contents in it right now.
Right, but we are conditioning the rescission of the first refusal on the application of a preservation restriction. This is what you're suggesting, or we are suggesting as a board. In that restriction, it would make sense to me that if there are historically significant items that may or may not, could be, should be viewed as owned by the town, or in the spirit of their existence in the town, could have been owned by the town. So I don't know how we would do that legally. But I'm still not grasping why we couldn't do it. What is it about a preservation restriction that it does? When we do preservation restrictions on land, we are careful to have the language state that the open space shall be undisturbed. That means you can't cut a blade of grass.
So I'm not an expert on preservation restrictions, and we can certainly put that in the letter. But I'm thinking that that we have the right of first refusal on the building and what was sold previously, which didn't have any of the historical society's contents in it. So I'll certainly put that in the letter that the town has the right of first refusal should the society decide to sell any of its historic
I would
contents in
highly
the museum.
recommend it. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Just as a thought, town property needs to be, when it's conveyed, has to go through town meeting. So if historic property is there, couldn't it be, required to go through town meeting to sell it?
Which was my thought exactly. Thank you, Colleen.
But the question is, who owns the property?
Right.
Because in Southborough, everything is in the gray area. All right, so,
Grant Barrington would like to speak.
okay. Hi, Grant.
Hey everyone, good morning. Yeah, I just had a quick question regarding Mr. Stein's comment. Perhaps I'm just not understanding what exactly he's requesting, but
Good question.
my understanding is that the Historical Society is it's a nonprofit organization. It's its own entity. It's not a town entity. So if they own certain items, are you suggesting that the town just confiscate those items because we feel like it in the
Well, let's look at the example of, I believe it's 41 Main Street. I can't remember what the Burnett House's address is right this second. But in that example, that property is owned by Mr. Deli Priscoli, and he is, owning it and received significant funding from the town in exchange for a preservation restriction. That preservation restriction limits what he, a private entity, can do with that collateral, especially, if I'm remembering it correctly, the exterior and the landscaping. So to address Mr. Farrington's question, yes, we can, based on that precedent, apply and enforce preservation restrictions on private property if the town was involved in the beginning, as we are in this case, and we do what we're supposed to do. Thanks.
Okay, I'm aware of that preservation restriction. My understanding was that that applied to the property, it's the land, what can be done with the land and the exterior of the building rather than the, the contents of, the ownership of the property. So yeah, perhaps I'm still a bit confused, but thanks for clarifying. Bye.
Well, Grant, think about it this way. If you, the town has a lot of historical records, and we may have given them for, safekeeping to the Historical Society. So those kind of things you wouldn't want to be conveyed. I mean, like Marnie said, there's a sour taste in everybody's mouth about a document that was sold.
But if the town gave up the ownership, then they didn't have an interest in what happened to the document afterwards. Am I wrong?
Is that
Do
what
we-
happened?
Do
Mr.
we know
Farrington?
that?
We don't know that.
Okay.
Yeah, what, could you, please enlighten me as to where you got that piece of information?
So do we know that that document was owned by the Historical Society and it wasn't the society holding town property?
I don't know that.
So I don't think anybody does. So I think that's
Okay.
Mr. Stein's point.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can tell you, it's my understanding that I think that the goal is to move the contents of the small school building behind the townhouse into the new location.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. And they'll have offices moved there, so I don't know what will become of the small schoolhouse, if they are gonna keep that as well, or and just move selective things, or if they're totally would be moving into the new location.
I think that's the intention, to move out.
Mhm.
All right, very good. So can I write a draft, Karina and Colleen, and then send it to you so you can stick it on town letterhead? And I'll get it to you today because I know you're both off tomorrow.
Yes, yes, absolutely. You get a test, we'll put it on our nice letterhead that we now,
Make
we're
pretty
trying
it
to
up.
transition, to the standard letterhead that the other departments use as well.
All right,
Excellent.
Could I just check in on a related subject, but it's not on our agenda? That discussion of whether major site plan approval is required on the property. Is that something that we're going to be speaking at in a future meeting?
I think we should be. The property currently has had a major site plan approval, which lapsed. And currently, I believe there is still the adaptive reuse of historic building special permit that is potentially valid until December of this year. And that special permit, I think the intent was to allow a commercial, so to speak, use for the antique auction house and art gallery to be located in a residential district. Which so they used that special permit avenue to be able to do that with a municipal building at the time. So it's my understanding that if it's a change of use, it would come back to the planning board. However, as a nonprofit 501(c), I believe, if your primary and dominant use is for educational purposes, which they may present in that fashion, it would fall under the Dover Amendment.
Mhm.
But it would still need to come to site plan for certain, public safety type aspects, just as they have to get their septic system, make sure it's still valid for what they're going to use it for parking and such, but they could have that use in that zone based on the Dover Amendment, if they qualify.
Yeah, can I make a comment on that, or is that not on our agenda? Because I have a question along this line, but I don't want to speak on something that's not posted on the agenda.
What's the question?
Well, so I've been doing a fair amount of reading on the Dover Amendment. The Dover Amendment clearly states that no zoning ordinance or bylaw, I'm reading from my other computer, shall regulate or restrict the interior area. And it goes on to discuss, really has to do with the exterior. My understanding from what I've read in the public, domain, and I've not spoken to anybody at the Historical Society, except for what was put into our Dropbox, to be honest. But my understanding is that there is not going to be a change to the exterior of the building or the parking area. So I don't see how that the new owners need to come back for major site plan. I know that, and I saw the plans for the original plans, I guess they were 2019, and had to do with some structural changes and maybe some parking changes and other things. I didn't look at it that closely because I didn't have a lot of time, but my understanding is that the Historical Society is not planning to make any such changes. I mean, if they're going to, add a ramp, that's, I think that, for wheelchair access or something. But, really, I think that their changes are really having to do with the use of the building, which major site plan doesn't cover. And I feel kind of ambivalent about the major site plan approval lapsing. Also, when I was a zoning board member, we did have developers come and had, their special permit ran out and they didn't come in a timely fashion to renew it. I mean, we had COVID going on, and even it was confusing for me. And I did ask for clarification of when exactly did the tolling stop during the emergency, and then when did it come back on? I wouldn't really expect anybody to be able to follow that, but certainly somebody, maybe Mr. Della Perscoli, should have asked. But we did have developers and come with their tail between their legs and say, sorry, I had we let it lapse. And so I don't know that major site plan approval or a modification is required. I would be interested to see a letter, for example, from the Historical Society or Mr. Wysan to describe if any changes are going to be made to the structure or the parking. And if not, I would say, so the major site plan, the permit expired. Does it apply now because of the Dover Amendment? I don't think that they're subject to, if they're not changing the structure, they're not changing the parking. I'm not sure that applies to them being a nonprofit and using the building for educational purposes. So I'm happy to be challenged on that, but that's my question is, do they really need to come back for modification, or can we just accept a letter saying they're not going to modify the building?
Well, it wouldn't be a modification per se.
It's a
right?
change of
So
use.
if you have, they're permitted for an antique auction house and a art gallery there. So,
Well, that was Mr. Della Perscoli.
and that is what the permit's for.
Right.
That's what the major, so anything different, if it's not Dover, would be brand new major site plan, not a modification. And
Okay.
because it's Dover, they may still come to site plan for certain aspects that don't involve those zoning criteria, like,
Parking and handicapped and
yeah. So if, we can't say you can't put that in there because of the zone or whatever, but, any non-conformance issues and things like that, but you still have to regulate,
safety.
yeah, safety issues.
So I guess
And-
that's my question is, so listened a little to the select board and again, just read, what you guys provided, what we found online and that sort of thing. But my presumption, I guess, is that there was no modification to the parking, no modification to the
So
building.
Debbie, I don't want to interrupt you. That's a good question, but that is a question for a future planning board meeting. And the board would have to decide whether or not they felt that they need to come forward. And there is specific guidance in our code on lapsing site plans.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. And I just, that's fine. I know that's not for this meeting. But I guess I would appreciate as a board member some clarity from the Historical Society of what it is that they intend to do. Maybe it's publicly posted. But if do they intend to put in a ramp, change parking, change the structure? That to me, I think would be something that would be interesting for the planning board to consider.
Yeah, we don't know anything other than what they posted on their website at this point.
Okay, good. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think that's that. Anything else properly before the board? If not, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
And
Second,
Okay, we have a motion and then a second. Any discussion? All in favor, Latrell, yes.
Stein, yes?
Houlihan, yes.
Demuria, yes.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Have a good one.
Have a great
Happy
day.
Labor
Holiday.
Day.
Yeah, happy Labor Day.
Happy
Thank
Labor
you.
Day.
Enjoy your days off, ladies.
Thank you.